Hey guys, we are going to go over the physiology of the respiratory system and how lung cancer affects the lungs. My name is Mauricio and I'm accompanied by my team members Rachel, Amy, and John. And without further ado, let's get started. Let's look at the anatomy of the lungs. We will be focusing on the alveolus and pleural sac for the next few minutes. This diagram shows a close-up of the lung and the pleural sac. The pleural sac is a double-walled, closed sac that separates the lungs from the thoracic wall. Inside the sac, we have the pleural cavity. Then we have the interpleural fluid that lubricates the surface of the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura so they may slide past one another during respiration. Next up is the alveoli. They are surrounded by pulmonary arteries and capillaries because this is where gas exchange occurs. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged between alveoli and blood by diffusion. Capillaries have very small membranes which allow for diffusion. This is explained under Fick's law of diffusion, which states that the shorter the distance through which diffusion takes place, the greater the rate of diffusion. Also, the greater the surface across where diffusion occurs, the greater the rate of diffusion. Now, a closer look at how diffusion occurs. Diffusion of oxygen occurs between alveoli and blood, and diffusion of carbon dioxide occurs between tissues and blood. Oxygen is poorly soluble, so the amount of O2 dissolved is directly proportional to the pressure of O2 in the blood. In other words, the higher the pressure of O2, the more O2 is dissolved. The rest of the oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. 70% of CO2 is transported in the form of bicarbonate ions, which act as a buffer for metabolic acids, helping to stabilize the body's pH. For CO2 to be released from the body, bicarbonate ions fuse with hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid, and with the help of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, carbonic acid converts back to CO2 and water. That CO2 is then diffused from the plasma into red blood cells and into the alveolus. Air moves from high pressure to lower pressure or down its pressure gradient. We look at three kinds of pressure to understand ventilation, which are atmospheric pressure, intraalveolar pressure, and intrapleural pressure. This is all explained by Boyle's law. Boyle's law explains how gas pressure increases and decreases by volume. The picture to the right shows how an increase of volume leads to a decrease of gas pressure, and a decrease of volume leads to an increase of gas pressure. Now let's apply Boyle's law to the respiratory system. For us to inhale, intraalveolar pressure must be less than atmospheric pressure for air to flow into the lungs, and for us to exhale, intraalveolar pressure must be greater than atmospheric pressure for air to flow out of the lungs. Physics laws are not the only ones for regulating our ventilation. Skeletal muscles such as the intercostal muscles and diaphragm help regulate our breathing. Since skeletal muscles are initiated by somatic motor neurons, we can control our breathing, up to a point. Chemoreceptors for CO2, O2, and hydrogen ions influence our rhythmic cycles of respiration. Neuroregulation of breathing is still widely unknown, but we do know that respiratory neurons located in the medulla control ventilation muscles. Now that we have covered the respiratory system, we're going to go look at lung cancer.
So now we will move on to talk about lung cancer. In the United States, the majority of cancer deaths are attributed to lung cancer for both men and women. Prostate, breast, pancreas, and colon cancer combined almost kill as many Americans a year as lung cancer does alone. Lung cancer is a type of cancer that develops in the lungs, the center of the respiratory system. Two major types of lung cancer are small cell lung carcinoma and non-small cell lung carcinoma. Small cell lung carcinoma is more common than non-small cell lung carcinoma and is typically developed due to heavy smoking. Non-small cell lung carcinomas include squamous cell lung cancer, adenocarcinomas, and large cell anaplastic carcinomas. Carcinomas are cancer cells that line the inner or outer surfaces of the body. Lung cancer specifically start in the cells that line the airways of lung. Cancer arises from mutations to normal cells. The natural growth and death of cells is unregulated, which then causes uncontrollable cell division. As you can see in the image on the slide, typically cells grow when healthy. If not, they die. However, with cancer cells, there is no cell death, and cells continuously grow. Cancerous cells are invasive and can grow into surrounding tissue and even block airways. Lung cancer metastases can spread to lymph nodes around the lungs, and they can also travel through the bloodstream to other organs. As a result, there are 5 stages that are referenced when describing the extent of lung cancer in the body.
So one example of how lung cancer can spread throughout the lung is pleural mesothelioma. Pleural mesothelioma is a type of cancer that develops on the lining of the lungs, known as pleura. This cancer occurs by inhalation of asbestos, which are mineral needle-like fibers that can travel to the floor and cause inflammation and scarring. Inflammation damages the cell's DNA and eventually leads to cancer cells that have uncontrolled cell growth. The malignant tumor that forms on the floor could develop either on the parietal floor, the outer layer, or visceral floor, the inner layer covering the lungs, that then spreads to the other layer. As you can see in this picture, there is plaque formation and flow on the right side of the lungs, compared to the normal lungs on the left side having no plaque formation visible. The uncontrolled growth throughout the lung will lead to shortness of breath, chest pain, and swelling on the face or arms.
So there are a lot of symptoms associated with lung cancer. Some of these can be confused with the common cold and flu, so it's important to seek medical attention if any of these persist. There are ways you can reduce your risk of lung cancer. Smoking is the number one cause of lung cancer, but radon is a huge risk factor as well that you may not know about. Radon is a naturally occurring radioactive gas, and when outside, radon breaks apart and disperses in the air. But it can also get trapped inside buildings where it becomes more concentrated over time. When we consistently expose ourselves to radon over time, it can cause harmful mutations, which may lead to lung cancer. If you are concerned about radon exposure, you can find radon test kits online for pretty cheap. There are many ways to treat cancer if you have it. We have traditional approaches like surgery and chemotherapy and radiation that are pretty well known, but the more progressive approaches are pretty interesting as well. Specifically, targeted therapy uses drugs to target specific genes or proteins that cause rapid cell division and growth, which opens up a lot of doors for cancer and genetic research. So that wraps up our presentation on the physiology of lung cancer. We'd like to thank Dr. Forsgren for teaching us about lung physiology to get us started with our project. Thank you for listening.